Hello everyone and welcome to the Unanswered Questions True Crime Podcast.
I have spent hours and hours investigating this.
He basically told her that people have been killed. Journalists, independent investigators, people like that disappeared. It frightened her to the bone.
There's more to the story than meets the eye.
There were rumors of torture and homicide and sexual abuse, all sorts of egregious, horrendous crimes.
He was polygraphed 3 times. Each of those 3 showed evasions.
His resumes were a skeleton of truth.
He was mad at the world, and particularly mad at the government.
The study that he commissioned had described a fictional terrorist attack.
If people have died over this, it means you're getting close to the truth.
You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to say, what the fuck?
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of my new podcast, Unanswered Questions, where every week we'll endeavour to discuss a mysterious unsolved case that has many lingering unanswered questions. So I hope you enjoy, and as always, leave me some feedback on what you think about the show and rate it as well. Now on to the show. This week we'll be talking about the infamous Dr. X killings. The Dr. X killings were a series of suspicious deaths by curare poisoning in 1966 at a Bergen County, New Jersey hospital. A newspaper investigation during the mid-1960s led to the indictment of an Argentina-born physician, Mario Enrique Jascalevich, born August 27th of 1927 and died September of 1984 in 1976. He was acquitted at trial in 1978. Murder by poisoning is now rare compared to a century or more ago. Firstly, the classic poisons are much less readily available. You cannot pop into the local chemist and buy the deadly poisonous alkaloid strychnine under the pretense that you want it for destroying garden moles. Arsenic compounds are now no longer ingredients in flypapers. Secondly, in suspicious deaths, analytical chemistry is far more effective at identifying unexpected substances in bodily remains, so laying the foundation for subsequent detective work. The medical profession and murder by poison have a fine connectivity, even in recent times. The most notorious is the case of Dr. Harold Shipman, who may have killed up to 230 of his patients by injections of morphine and heroin. A century earlier, the story of Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen, who poisoned his wife using hyoscyamine, still resonates today. This connection between doctors and poisoning arises because they have access to drugs that the general population does not have, has knowledge of the drug's actions and how to administer them without causing obvious suspicion, and are connected in the public mind with saving lives, not bringing them to a premature end. Now we come to the career of Jascalevich. Jascalevich was born in Buenos Aires on August 27th of 1927. After completing his medical training in Argentina, he came to the United States to perform an internship at Passaic General Hospital in 1955, setting up his practice in New Jersey. He was hired as a surgeon by Riverdale Hospital in Oradell, New Jersey in 1962, and developed a surgical stapler that was named for him. At the time of his murder trial, he was a resident of Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. Now we come to the initial investigation in this case. In 1966, authorities with the Bergen County, New Jersey prosecutor, including Guy W. Calasai, launched an investigation of 9 suspicious deaths at Riverdale Hospital in Oradell. The patients had been administered to the hospital for surgery and died of unrelated causes before or after routine surgical procedures. The first was a man of 73 years old, admitted for a hernia repair. Jascalevich said he was not fit for surgery due to mild congestive heart failure, and he put him on an intravenous drip. The patient died a few minutes later. A few months later, a 4-year-old girl had her appendix removed by another surgeon, Dr. Stanley Harris. She was progressing well and told a nurse that she wanted to go home. A few minutes later, she was also dead. A succession of suspicious fatalities followed, and Dr. Harris and his colleague Dr. Lanz reviewed the case and noted several similarities. All the patients had intravenous access via a drip. All the deaths were sudden, wholly unexpected, and seemed to involve respiratory arrest. Many occurred at about 8 a.m, and last but not least, Dr. Jascalevich seemed to have been near all the patients. Using his own initiative, Dr. Harris decided to open Jascalevich's locker. He found several vials, both sealed and half-used, of curare, a poison, and syringes of curare. The directors of the hospital were alerted, and a warrant was obtained to conduct a formal search of the locker. Now we come to what curare is and how it's used in medicine. Curare, pronounced curare, was used by South American Indians as arrow poison. It was derived from local plants which they used to kill prey for food. In sufficient quantity, curare paralyzes muscles so that the prey cannot escape and dies because it stops breathing. It was first brought to Europe by the explorer Charles Marie de la Condamine and extensively investigated by physiologists in the 19th century. But it was not until the mid-20th century that it was realized that as it caused paralysis, if it were to be safely used in medical applications, it had to be combined with artificial ventilation. The nerve impulse from the brain along the nerve is electrical, but when it reaches the nerve ending, it becomes chemical. Acetylcholine is released, which passes through the junction onto receptors on the muscle and causes it to contract. Curare sits on these receptors so the acetylcholine cannot reach them. Provided that the subject is kept alive by artificial ventilation, eventually the curare dissipates and the subject recovers voluntary muscle control. Curare itself is no longer used in anesthesia as better synthetic analogues are now available. These drugs have revolutionized anesthesia and surgery. An anesthetized patient can now be kept lightly anesthetized but completely paralyzed so that surgeons can gain access to areas which were impossible previously. At the end of surgery, these drugs can be reversed and recovery from anesthesia is more rapid as less anesthetic agents need to be used. When challenged, Jascalevich claimed that he had been using the drug as an anesthetic adjunct for experimental work in connection with liver biopsies on dogs. Afterwards, he went to his research laboratories and performed a dog experiment. A check revealed that some of his curare had been legitimately purchased, but some could have been stolen from the hospital pharmacy and planted by someone else in his locker in an attempt to frame him. Because of this, and because the prosecution was told that curare could not be found in human tissue, the case was dropped. Early in 1967, Dr. Jascalevich left Riverdale Hospital and the mortality rate dropped. No motive could be ascertained for homicide. 10 years passed before the state charged Jascalevich with 5 counts of murder in May of 1976. Now we come to the newspaper investigation. The case had lain dormant for a decade when the New York Times received a letter from a woman claiming that as many as 40 patients had been murdered at a hospital by its chief surgeon. The letter, handed to reporter M.A. Farber, offered no information as to where the alleged murders had occurred or who the murderer was, if there was anything at all to the letter. Farber pursued the case by speaking with someone in the forensic toxicology field who was able to recall a case at Riverdale Hospital at a private medical facility that had since closed. Further investigation led to the identification of Dr. Mario Jascalevich as the hospital's chief surgeon. While Jascalevich's surgical patients routinely survived, those of a new surgeon were dying at a significantly high rate. This new surgeon, together with directors of the hospital, opened Jascalevich's locker on October 31st of 1966 and found 18 near-empty vials of curare, a powerful muscle relaxant that could cause death if not administered in conjunction with artificial respiration. The hospital reported their findings to the Bergen County, New Jersey prosecutor's office and its chief at the time, Guy W. Kellersey. Farber was given the opportunity to review the files from the 1966 investigation, found a comment from Kellersey that said that, quote, "someone is lying," end quote. Though Kellersey's suspicions were strong, he and his assistant Fred C. Gelder had come to the conclusion at the time that hard evidence did not exist to move further with the case. When Farber contacted Kellersey in 1975, Kellersey called the claim that the circumstances of the deaths were plausible to be horse shit and remained convinced that his suspicions in the case were accurate, that there had been criminal actions involved in the deaths. Farber's investigations led him to try to contact the families of the potential victims, in some cases notifying relatives for the first time that the deaths had been deemed suspicious. His attempts to contact Jascalevich, then in private practice, were all unsuccessful, despite repeated letters, phone calls, and even attempts to approach him outside of his offices. Farber tried to follow up on Jascalevich's statements in his 1966 deposition that the curare had been used in experiments on dying dogs, but was unable to get any confirmation that dogs had been supplied to him as described. The results of Farber's investigation were first published in the Times in January of 1976, referring to the unidentified physician as Dr. X, and caused a media stir. The Record, the largest paper in the area, picked up the story, covering it with as many as 13 reporters. Other papers nationwide picked up the story as well. Bergen County prosecutor Woodcock opened an independent investigation exhuming the bodies of 5 possible victims, none of whom had been administered curare during their surgical procedures. Using new technologies, investigators found traces of curare in 3 of the bodies. Dr. Michael Baden, Deputy Medical Examiner for New York, reviewed the case notes and commented, quote, "It is my professional opinion that the majority of the cases reviewed are not explainable on the basis of natural causes and are consistent with having been caused by a respiratory depressant. It is my opinion that recent technological advances now permit the detection of very minute amounts of curare removed from dead bodies." End quote. Now we come to the trial. The Bergen County grand jury issued an indictment on May 18th of 1976, charging Jascalevich with the deaths of 5 patients, that being Emma Arts, age 70, Frank Biggs, age 59, Margaret Henderson, age 26, Carl Robeck, age 73, and Nancy Savino, aged 4, and having injected them with curare to kill them. Once brought to trial, 2 of the murder counts were dismissed. The prosecution was led by Sybil Moses, an assistant prosecutor who was 4 years out of law school. Jascalevich was represented by attorney Raymond A. Brown. At trial in 1978, 2 of the murder counts were dismissed for lack of evidence. Brown filed a subpoena requesting that Farber turn over all of his notes and other writings related to 193 potential witnesses in the case, what Farber would later call, quote, "the broadest subpoena ever issued to an American reporter," end quote. The scientific issues that were being deliberated were: what happens to human tissue embalmed and interred for a decade? Would the drug have changed chemically or have been destroyed entirely over a 10-year period? Assuming that curare had been injected, what analytical techniques could be used to trace sub-microgram amounts of it? Could components in embalming fluids or bacteria react chemically to form substances giving a false positive reading in the analytical procedures? If the forensic analysis indicated the presence of curare in the patient's tissues, was Dr. Jascalevich the person who injected them with it? His defense challenged the chemistry underpinning the analyses and raised uncertainties over this last point. Principal defense witness Abraham Stolman, chief toxicologist, State of Connecticut Department of Health, said, quote, "Currently the reported analytical methods relied upon by the prosecution, which include ultraviolet absorption spectroscopy, thin layer chromatography, high pressure liquid chromatography, and radioimmune assay, alone or in conjunction, lacks such a degree or specificity with any degree of scientific certainty required to support the opinion that they identified the isolated material as D-tubocurane, i.e. curare, in the embalmed, decomposed and skeletonizing tissues that had been in the ground for 10 years under varying climatic conditions," end quote. Experienced users of thin layer chromatography will know how difficult it is to be certain that one ascending spot, or more likely smudge, is moving at the same rate as the reference one. Even if it is, does the coincidence imply that the 2 substances, analyte and reference, are identical? Now we come to the analytical chemistry. Missing from Stolman's list was mass spectrometry. This technique was used by both the prosecution and defense. A prosecution witness, David Beggs from the Hewlett-Packard Corporation, said he had found curare in the tissues from one of the patients, Nancy Savino, and that samples from 2 other exhumations contained possible traces of curare. However, under cross-examination, he stated that mass spectrometry is not an absolute test for curare, but just indicated that it was there. Today, we would combine the spectrometry with capillary gas chromatography. If reference curare matched the analyte, both with respect to GC retention time and with an MS fingerprint, then the result would not be disputable. Now we come to establishing a method. A defense witness, Frederick Reeders, former chief toxicologist in Philadelphia, said the only procedure that he considered as providing unequivocal evidence for the presence of curare was, indeed, mass spectrometry. A reliance should be placed on the whole fingerprint spectrum rather than the more sensitive selected ion monitoring method. Having established a method for showing up traces of curare, Reeders tested the stability of curare against embalming fluids and the liquids produced by bodies whilst they decompose. It was detectable for a few days, but after this period he could not find any traces of it or plausible decomposition products that indicated its original presence. In reviewing his results, Lawrence Hall and Hirsch said, quote, "These liquids altered curare chemically to the point where it was no longer recognizable as such." He concluded that the rapid rate of decomposition meant that to detect curare in the specimens of 1976 would have required huge, medically impossible amounts to have been present in 1966, end quote. Now we come to the inconsistent evidence. However, readers had another surprise in store for the jury. His methodology confirmed one of the prosecution's assertions. He too found curare in the liver from Nancy Savino. However, this observation was accompanied by some concerns. Firstly, in the light of his work on the instability of curare towards embalming and decomposing fluids, it should not have shown up at all. Secondly, he found that the curare, despite having been in a most unpromising environment for a decade, was highly and inexplicably pure. Thirdly, he found curare only in the child's liver, not in her muscle tissue. The drug, administered by intravenous injection, should have perfused the whole body, with the possible exception of the brain, and a positive liver result should have been matched by a positive tissue result. In the report, it's not able to ascertain what interpretations the defense made from these findings. Possibly the least suspicious one would be from some form of accidental contamination, which occurred whilst handling the child's liver. In October 1978, the jury retired to consider its verdict, and had to consider a mass of circumstantial evidence, an array of allegedly positive chemical tests advanced by the prosecution, and the doubts raised by the defense as to the validity of the results. It had to weigh the research results from Dr. Writers and deliver a verdict. This only took 2 hours. After 34 weeks of testimony, Jascalevich was acquitted by jurors on October 24th of 1978. Now we come to a list of possible victims in this case. The possible victims include Karl Robeck, age 73, who died on December 13th of 1965. Nancy Savino, aged 4, died March 21st of 1966. Margaret Henderson, aged 26, died April 23rd of 1966. Edith Post, aged 62, died May 17th of 1966. Ira Holster, aged 64, died July 29th of 1966. Frank Biggs, aged 59, died August 27th of 1966. Mary Mutiner, aged 80, died September 1st of 1966. Emma Arts, aged 70, died September 23rd of 1966. And lastly, Ellen Shorth, aged 36, died October 23rd, 1966. Now we come to post-acquittal. In October 1980, the New Jersey Board of Medical Examiners revoked Jascalevich's license to practice medicine in the state of New Jersey, finding by a vote of 11-0 that Jascalevich was guilty of gross malpractice or gross negligence and fail of good moral character. End quote. Jascalevich had voluntarily surrendered his license in 1976 after being indicted in the criminal case for which he was later acquitted. Interestingly enough, the state found in their investigation fraudulently prepared operation records in one case, and in another that Jascalevich had made a diagnosis of cancer that he knew or should have known was false. Both patients had been admitted to Christ Hospital and had been from Jersey City, New Jersey. At the time that his New Jersey license was taken away, Jascalevich was practicing in the Bronx with a valid New York State license. In January 1982, Governor of New Jersey Brendan Byrne issued a pardon to reporter M.A. Farber and ordered that the $101,000 in fines be returned to the Times. The paper's attorney, Floyd Abrams, was planning efforts to file for return of the additional $185,000 that had been assessed in civil contempt fines. In June 1984, Riverdale Hospital on Kimbercamack Road in Oradell was demolished. A former administrator of the hospital told a newspaper reporter that admissions had dropped significantly once the hospital and doctor were identified in the media, and that the hospital's ability to attract qualified physicians had been severely harmed. The 80-bed hospital changed its name to Northern Community Hospital in 1979. By 1981, the decision was made to close the hospital as only a third of its patients' beds were filled, and the hospital was losing $250,000 annually. Efforts to turn the site into an alcohol rehabilitation centre were turned down, and the site became a target of vandalism. A 300-bed nursing home was proposed to fill the empty site of the demolished building. Now we come to the death of Dr. Jascalevich. After losing his license to practice medicine, Jascalevich returned to Argentina. He died in September 1984 in Mar del Plata from a cerebral hemorrhage, age 57, although the death was not reported to the public for several months, until an obituary appeared in the New York Times. The deaths at Riverdale remain unsolved, although Jascalevich is assumed by some to have been guilty. Were the patients killed by Dr. Jascalevich via curare? Or is there a more simple explanation? We may never know the true answer to that, sadly. With that, this case remains open, but with many unanswered questions still remain unanswered. Please rate the show and let me know what you guys think about this and the many other cases I've covered. You can follow me on all major social media platforms, YouTube, BitChute, Dailymotion. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram. Links are all down below in the description. If you have a case you'd like me to have a look at or cover, don't hesitate to send me a message. I'm your host, and this has been the Unanswered Questions Podcast. Until next time. Next on Unanswered Questions. The Hartford Circus Fire, which occurred on July 6 of 1944 in Hartford, Connecticut, was one of the worst fire disasters in United States history.